If you've ever loved someone who kept pulling away, not because they felt nothing, but because being truly seen terrified them, this message is for you. Sometimes the people who appear the most independent are actually the ones carrying the deepest fear of emotional intimacy. One of the most fascinating parts of human behavior, especially when we talk about avoidant attachment, is the intense need for control that can appear when someone feels emotionally unsafe. Avoidants often live by one powerful belief: never rely too heavily on another person. Somewhere along the way, they learned that needing love, trusting someone, or revealing their emotions could leave them vulnerable. So they create distance, they build emotional walls, they retreat whenever things become too intimate, and they convince themselves that staying detached means staying in control. But that sense of control is often the first thing to disappear when they lose someone who genuinely loved them. It usually doesn't happen dramatically. There may be no immediate breakdown or obvious regret. Instead, it begins quietly through thoughts, explanations, and carefully constructed excuses. They tell themselves, "I only needed space. The relationship wasn't right for me. They expected too much." These explanations become emotional protection. They help the avoidant avoid guilt, responsibility, and the uncomfortable feelings they've spent years learning to suppress. But eventually, that protection begins to crack. Because genuine love has a way of creating emotional safety that cannot easily be replaced. When someone offers you steady, sincere, unconditional connection, and that connection suddenly disappears, the emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. The silence feels different. The absence becomes noticeable. And eventually, the person who once believed distance would make them feel safer begins to realize how much that distance actually cost them. For many avoidants, control feels comforting because unpredictability once felt dangerous. Some may have grown up in environments where emotions were ignored, criticized, rejected, or simply never discussed. They learned that expressing feelings could create conflict or disappointment. As adults, they naturally gravitate toward what feels manageable: independence, logic, personal space, and emotional distance. But here's the contradiction. The moment they believe they have everything under control may actually be the moment they're losing the very connection they wanted to protect themselves from needing. Avoidance isn't the same thing as emotional control. It's often fear disguised as independence. And sooner or later, avoiding what you feel becomes more painful than facing it. Then comes a moment when the avoidant begins to see their own behavior from the outside. They notice that the person who once kept reaching out isn't reaching anymore. The messages become less frequent. The effort disappears. The warmth they were accustomed to receiving is suddenly gone. And it isn't necessarily because the other person became bitter or stopped caring. It's because they finally started choosing themselves. That's when the illusion begins to collapse. The silence that once gave the avoidant a sense of power can suddenly become the very thing confronting them with their loss. They may have believed that pulling away meant they could decide when the relationship continued and when it stopped. But reality eventually teaches them something different. You cannot control another person's willingness to keep loving you. You can only control your own choices. And that realization can be incredibly painful, because genuine connection leaves an imprint. You can distract yourself, you can stay busy, you can act unaffected. You can convince everyone, including yourself, that you have moved on. But emotional experiences don't simply disappear because you refuse to acknowledge them. The mind can suppress memories, but the emotional system can still carry what happened. And the irony is that the person they pushed away may have been the person who made vulnerability feel safe enough to explore in the first place. That's what makes the situation so tragic. The love that could have challenged their deepest fears was also the love their fear convinced them to reject. Eventually, there may come a point where they can no longer hide behind logic, pride, or rational explanations. They have to sit with the consequences. They have to acknowledge what their distance created. They have to feel the emotions they spent so much time avoiding. And if you've been wondering whether they'll ever understand what they lost, they may. But that realization usually doesn't happen while you're still standing in front of them, trying to explain your value. It doesn't happen while you're constantly available, sending messages, offering reassurance, or trying to convince them that the connection mattered. As long as you're there to absorb the consequences for them, they don't have to fully experience the emptiness created by their own choices. Sometimes the lesson only becomes real when they turn around and discover that the person they expected to remain available has finally moved forward. That's when growth can begin. Not your growth. You already started growing when you stopped chasing what was hurting you. Their growth begins when they finally understand that emotional intimacy isn't a threat. Love doesn't make someone weak. Vulnerability doesn't destroy independence. Being emotionally honest simply makes you human. All those walls, excuses, and years of running were never truly about escaping another person. They were about escaping the parts of themselves they were afraid to confront. And here's the quiet truth. Love doesn't become meaningless simply because someone was too afraid to receive it. It can remain through the lessons it left behind, the self-awareness it created, and the strength you developed because of the pain. An avoidant may eventually return, but sometimes returning isn't about rebuilding the exact relationship that was lost. Sometimes it's about finally understanding something they were incapable of understanding before. They may never admit it directly, but somewhere inside, they may recognize the truth. They didn't lose control, they lost connection. And perhaps that realization becomes the beginning of genuine emotional freedom. Not freedom created through silence, walls, and distance, but freedom created through honesty. They begin to understand that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's courage. Because real love was never something to manage, manipulate, or control. It was something to experience. And they may finally recognize it when your silence is no longer an invitation for them to return, but a boundary that tells them you have chosen yourself. That's when the illusion of control truly falls apart. Because losing control can become the moment they finally understand what their need for control cost them. Real love, real connection, and the opportunity to experience something meaningful. And once that awareness arrives, it can permanently change how they see themselves and relationships. You don't have to chase closure. Sometimes their realization becomes the closure you were waiting for. One of the most difficult things to understand about avoidant behavior is how differently they can experience loss. Their emotions may not arrive at the same time as yours. When the relationship ends, they may not immediately break down. They may not cry. They may not appear devastated. In those first few days, they can seem surprisingly calm, detached, or even relieved. But that doesn't always mean they feel nothing. Sometimes the emotions are simply delayed. From the outside, they can look completely fine, calm, composed, almost relieved. They may tell themselves that walking away was the right choice, that the relationship demanded too much, that you were too emotional, or that they simply needed more freedom. For a while, they genuinely believe that version of the story. But beneath that calm exterior, something very different can be happening. Emotional shutdown. What looks like peace isn't always peace. Sometimes it's numbness. Sometimes it's the mind switching into survival mode because feeling everything at once feels too overwhelming. When someone with avoidant tendencies feels exposed, emotionally trapped, or deeply vulnerable, their nervous system can interpret intimacy as danger. Instead of confronting those emotions, they disconnect from them. They create distance. They become cold. They convince themselves that they don't care. It isn't necessarily because they have no feelings. Sometimes it's because their feelings feel too threatening to handle. That emotional numbness becomes a form of protection. It's armor they've learned to wear, often long before the relationship ever existed. It protects them from rejection, disappointment, abandonment, and the fear of depending on someone. But eventually, even the strongest emotional defenses can weaken. The truth doesn't disappear simply because someone refuses to look at it. At first, something small may bring the memories back. A song, a familiar place, a scent, a random moment that reminds them of you. Or perhaps it's simply another quiet night when they realize their phone isn't lighting up anymore. The silence that once felt peaceful suddenly feels heavy. That's when the delayed emotions can begin to surface. They don't necessarily remember the relationship as one perfect romantic story. Instead, memories return in fragments. Your laugh, a conversation they didn't appreciate at the time, the way you understood them without demanding an explanation, the sense of comfort they experienced around you but didn't know how to acknowledge. And eventually, the pain becomes about more than missing you. They begin to understand what their own choices cost them. That's when numbness can turn into grief. And grief doesn't always arrive like an explosion. Sometimes it develops slowly, showing up in quiet moments when there is nothing left to distract them. It slips through the cracks in the emotional walls they spent years building. For so long, they may have told themselves that they didn't need anyone, that independence was strength, that emotional distance meant freedom. But eventually, they discover something uncomfortable. Being completely disconnected isn't freedom. It's loneliness disguised as independence. This creates an internal conflict. Their mind keeps repeating, "I'm okay alone," while another part of them quietly responds, "Then why does this hurt so much?" That contradiction becomes harder to ignore. They begin realizing that walking away didn't eliminate the pain. It simply postponed it. And by the time those feelings become clear, something else may have changed. You may have rebuilt your confidence. You may have stopped questioning your worth. You may have stopped sending the messages, stopped chasing explanations, and stopped trying to convince someone to recognize what you were offering. You found peace without their participation. And that's often when the emotional distance they relied on starts becoming uncomfortable for them. They may finally recognize that the person they kept pushing away was someone who made them feel emotionally understood and safe, even though they didn't know how to receive that safety. Then something deeper can happen. They begin to understand your experience. They remember the moments when you felt ignored, confused, rejected, or emotionally alone. The silence they once used to create distance now becomes something they personally experience. The space they believed would protect them becomes the very thing that isolates them. And regret begins to appear. Not necessarily because they've suddenly become perfectly self-aware or emotionally mature, but because eventually the pain of losing the connection becomes louder than the pride that kept them distant. During those quiet moments, they may realize that they didn't simply lose a relationship. They lost someone who could see beyond their defenses and still choose to care. They remember your patience, your consistency, the way your love wasn't about controlling them. You wanted to understand them. And they may finally recognize that what they called freedom was often fear. They weren't always running away from you. They were running away from the parts of themselves that were terrified of being truly known. Meanwhile, you learned something they may still be struggling to understand. silence doesn't always mean waiting. Sometimes silence means healing. It means peace. It means finally releasing the need for another person to validate your worth. You've stopped interpreting distance as proof of deeper feelings. You've stopped waiting for someone who isn't emotionally available to suddenly love you in the same way you loved them. And even if they eventually recognize your value, you may no longer be standing where they left you. You've moved beyond the waiting, beyond the confusion, beyond the need for them to finally understand. Their story might come back around, but you've already entered a chapter they may no longer have access to. And while they sit with the consequences of the distance they created, you may discover something far more valuable than their return, peace that doesn't depend on anyone else. They may always remember the person who saw them clearly and loved them anyway. They may remember how their silence once felt like control, only to realize later that it was actually creating loss. And you'll remember something different. Your silence wasn't weakness. It was the moment you returned to yourself. The human heart has a way of bringing buried emotions back to the surface. You can suppress them. You can cover them with work, distractions, new people, or endless activity. But eventually, what remains unresolved asks to be acknowledged. And when that emotional alarm finally sounds, everything they pushed away can return at once. Love, loss, fear, longing, regret. They may begin to understand that avoiding emotions doesn't destroy them. It simply delays them until they're much harder to carry. That is often the real battle happening inside avoidance. The struggle between the story someone tells themselves and the reality they eventually have to face. Every time we choose temporary comfort instead of emotional honesty, we can push the deeper pain further into the future. But there can come a point when staying disconnected hurts more than becoming vulnerable. That's the breaking point, the moment they finally understand that love wasn't the enemy. Their fear of losing control was. And remember this, their delayed emotional reaction doesn't erase what you experienced. You felt the relationship while it was happening because you were emotionally present. You allowed yourself to care. You allowed yourself to hurt. You didn't hide from your own heart. That is courage. They may have looked calm while you were falling apart, only to struggle emotionally after you've already begun rebuilding yourself. That is often the painful irony of avoidance. When the numbness finally fades, they can begin to understand that genuine connection isn't something that suffocates you. Healthy connection can actually make you feel more alive. Real emotional safety isn't created through control. It's created through trust. And perhaps the love they once ran from was never trying to trap them. Perhaps it was offering them the chance to escape the emotional prison they had built around themselves. This is where the deepest reflection begins. They start replaying the moments they withdrew instead of communicating, the times they shut down when you needed reassurance, the moments they interpreted your care as pressure, the conversations they avoided. For once, they can't easily blame everything on you. With enough distance, they may finally see the difference. You weren't necessarily too emotional. They were emotionally unavailable. You weren't trying to control them. They were trying to escape intimacy. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for presence. And the mirror doesn't only reveal what they did, it can reveal why they did it. But awareness alone doesn't heal anyone. It's only the beginning. Sometimes it's the most painful beginning because they start recognizing that the very behaviors they used to protect themselves, withdrawal, detachment, silence, and control, were also the behaviors that destroyed the connection they secretly needed. They tried to avoid rejection and eventually created it themselves. They tried to protect their heart and ended up hurting it. And those realizations don't necessarily arrive all at once. They can come in waves. They remember every time you tried to communicate and they dismissed it. Every time you needed emotional support and they became distant. Every time you remained patient even though you were hurting. What once seemed insignificant now carries an entirely different meaning. They begin to understand that love was never asking them to be perfect. It was asking them to be present. But they were so focused on protecting themselves that they couldn't show up fully. And this realization isn't only about missing you, it's about confronting who they've become. They begin to see that avoidance has consequences. Silence has weight. Emotional distance doesn't automatically make someone stronger. Sometimes it simply separates them from the very experiences that make life meaningful. And eventually, they have to ask themselves a question they spent years avoiding. How safe can you really be if you're completely alone emotionally? And how free are you if every meaningful connection ends the moment you become afraid? It doesn't happen immediately because avoidance often creates the illusion that there is always more time. They assume love will remain exactly where they left it. They believe that no matter how far they pull away, the person who cared about them will still be there someday, patient, understanding, and willing to begin again. But life doesn't pause for anyone. Love doesn't remain frozen while someone hides from emotional intimacy. And when an avoidant finally realizes that the person they pushed away is no longer waiting, something inside them can begin to collapse. That's the awakening. What makes that moment so powerful isn't simply the feeling of rejection. It's the realization that completely changes how they understand everything that happened. For so long, they may have believed that distance created safety. They may have mistaken control for strength and independence for emotional freedom. But when they turn around and discover that the connection has continued without them, that entire belief system can begin to fall apart. They realize that the loneliness they were trying so hard to avoid was created by the very defenses they believed would protect them. It's not necessarily that they suddenly started loving you. It's that they finally understand how deeply they cared. And the painful part is realizing it after the opportunity has already changed. Everything they postponed begins catching up with them. They discover that love cannot simply be placed on hold and expected to remain untouched. You cannot neglect a connection indefinitely and assume it will still have the same life when you return. A relationship needs presence. It needs communication, effort, attention, and emotional participation. When someone repeatedly withholds those things, they aren't creating extra time. They're slowly weakening the bond. So when they eventually decide to return, they may discover that the emotional ground they once ignored is no longer the same. Their defenses begin to feel different too. The walls that once made them feel protected can start feeling like barriers. The independence they once celebrated can begin to resemble emptiness. The solitude that once felt peaceful can become uncomfortable. The long nights feel longer. The mornings are quieter. There are no messages waiting, no familiar conversation, no person automatically checking in. And the silence that once gave them relief can eventually become the thing they can't escape. They see other people laughing, connecting, building relationships, and moving forward with their lives. And somewhere inside, a painful thought appears. I could have had that. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's almost impossible to explain, but it carries a sense of finality. Then the deeper questions begin. Why did I keep pulling away? What was I actually afraid of? Why did closeness feel so dangerous? Why did I assume love would eventually hurt me? And if they're willing to look honestly at themselves, they may begin tracing those answers back much further than the relationship itself. They may remember experiences from childhood, when expressing emotions didn't feel safe, times when affection was inconsistent, moments when vulnerability resulted in rejection, criticism, disappointment, or abandonment. They begin to understand that their fear wasn't created by the person they loved. The relationship simply activated something that was already there. And eventually, they may recognize one of the hardest truths of all. Fear wasn't protecting them. Fear was controlling them. It had followed them quietly for years, the fear of being controlled, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of becoming dependent, the fear of being completely known. It disguised itself as independence. It looked like self-sufficiency. It sounded like, "I don't need anyone." But underneath, it was often self-protection. And when they finally recognize that, they begin to understand what freedom actually means. Freedom isn't necessarily having no one to depend on. Freedom is being able to love without constantly expecting danger. It's being able to stay when things become emotionally uncomfortable. It's allowing yourself to feel without immediately escaping. It's trusting another person enough to let yourself be known. That is the paradox of the avoidant awakening. They may eventually discover that love was never the thing threatening their freedom. Their fear was. But by the time they understand that lesson, the person who could have shown them a different experience of love may already have moved forward. The person who waited, the person who remained grounded, the person who tried to create emotional safety, that person may no longer be the same. Because while the avoidant was trying to maintain distance, the other person was learning self-respect. They learned that their worth doesn't need to be proven to someone who refuses to recognize it. They learned that loving someone doesn't require abandoning themselves. And they learned that walking away isn't always giving up. Sometimes walking away is finally choosing yourself. Here's the truth that often goes unspoken. When you lose a genuinely meaningful connection, you don't simply lose another person. You can also lose access to a version of yourself, the version capable of giving, receiving, trusting, and experiencing love openly. That kind of loss can change you. It can force you to question everything you once believed about safety, intimacy, independence, and emotional connection. And if you're the person who loved someone with avoidant tendencies, remember this. You were never responsible for rescuing them from their own emotional wounds. You couldn't heal their fear for them. Your role was never to endlessly prove that you were safe enough, patient enough, understanding enough, or loving enough. Perhaps all you could do was show them through your presence what genuine emotional safety could feel like. What they choose to do with that lesson belongs to them. Their healing isn't your responsibility. It happens when they are finally willing to face themselves honestly. That's what the real breaking point can represent. Not revenge, not punishment, awareness. It's the moment life forces someone to recognize that they cannot endlessly outrun intimacy, control every emotional outcome, or avoid pain without eventually sacrificing something beautiful in return. Because every defense has a cost, and eventually they may realize that the price of protecting themselves from emotional pain was also losing access to emotional joy. Love doesn't always disappear because someone runs from it. Sometimes it stays long enough to teach them something. Then eventually, it moves forward. And when that person is no longer there, the silence that remains can become the lesson they needed all along. Because sometimes, the greatest awakening doesn't come when someone finally gets you back. It comes when they finally understand why they lost you.